Welcome to Grew with Portia, the podcast that uncovers the hidden treasures within grief. I'm your host, Portia the producer, and I'm inviting you to join me on a transformative journey where we will exchange laughter, of course the best medicine of them all, reflect on cherished memories, remember that time that the little boy grabbed my hand instead of his mother's at the amusement park? Yikes. And of course discover gratitude while navigating one of life's hardest challenges, loss. So get ready to grow with me, Portia the producer. Let's dive in. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Groove with Portia. I am your host, Portia Booker, and as always, please like, share, and subscribe to keep up with the latest and greatest of all with Groove with Portia. So today, everybody, I have the honor of having Dr. Cristi Bundukamara, who will go by Dr. B for this conversation. Dr. B is the founder of the clinic Mentally Strong, based in Colorado. She is also an author, the author of Pain and Purpose, My Journey to Mental Strength. And she is also the mother of 7. But as many of you know, I love to have people who have experienced transitions in their life come on the show and share how they found their groove through these adverse circumstances. And today we're going to talk to Cristi, Dr. B, about her journey and how she found pain, found purpose through her pain. So welcome, Dr. B, to Groove with Portia. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. B, you know, one of the things I love to start my conversations off with is gratitude. What are you grateful for today?
Ooh, it sounds cliche, but definitely my relationship with God and being able to have that like solid spiritual connection with my children who have passed.
And you know, Dr. B, I'm glad you brought that up because I know when we experience loss, right? Sometimes it shatters our faith. Sometimes it makes us question. And you've experienced the transition of 3 out of your 7 children and also your beloved husband. And I'm curious, Dr. B, what did it take for you to walk towards your faith and not walk away when you had these transitions happen?
Yeah, so I can tell you it was a huge journey. I would say that I had a born again experience at about age 19. I had 2 biological children, adopted 5 children from the foster care system. So they were older, they came with trauma and things like that. So we are in the midst of trying to manage that in a godly way. And our first tragedy happened where Johnny died in a drowning accident. And then within a year, my son Reggie started having catastrophic epilepsy. And Reggie is biological, and he just was very sick. And so we never really got to grieve the loss of Johnny while we are fighting for our son's life, Reggie. And my adopted children, and the only reason I say adopted children because they came with this trauma, and then they were going into their adolescent years and just began kind of manifesting that trauma, right? You can imagine. So they're manifesting their trauma. I'm trying to take care of my sick child and just overwhelmed and never losing my faith, but beginning to question, like, I'm doing all the right things. Like I was, this person that had like the black and white, like, this is what God likes and this is what God hates, right? And I'm doing all the what God likes. And I don't think it's that simple anymore. My spiritual walk has changed tremendously. But in my mind, I'm doing all of the right things. And so therefore blessings should come. And so I thought that, okay, my son is going to be healed. My son that was very sick, because there's no way God would let me lose more than one child. Like that's just, people lose one child and that's horrible, right? So we went through 10 years of medical trauma with Reggie. And in the midst of that, I developed what I now call the Mentally Strong method, but it was really just a survival. Like I'm trying to survive what I'm going through. And I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. So I had like the educational background But when you have to practice what you preach, it's completely different. And, so I created this mentally strong method, and I'm, trying to save my child. And I'm losing a little bit of faith because I had a very profound experience with God, and he told me that he was going to heal my son. And I had other believers tell me, oh, well, maybe on the, in heaven he heals them. And I was adamant that God was going to heal my son. And he did not. Like my son just got worse and worse and worse. He was born normal. Seizures started at age 6. Um, by age 11, he couldn't walk anymore. By age 15, he was confined to a wheelchair 100% of the time, being G-tube fed. So his last years of his life, I I wouldn't pray for him back, right? Like it was, he passed in 2016. And I tell you that he was a biological child because my daughter and my husband had the same genetic condition, but they were not sick like he was. My husband began showing very mild signs around age 45, but not even ones you would go to the doctor for. Just be like, oh, you're getting clumsy, or you're losing your memory, like um, the things you would joke about, but you wouldn't go to the doctor for, not until age 45. And so I thought, even though my daughter genetically had the same condition, I thought, well, if my husband lived till at least 45, my daughter's going to live till at least 45, right? Because she's also not um, showing signs, but she did have seizures, but very different than my son. Her seizures, when she would have a seizure, it would be like one, and the doctor would adjust her medication, and then she wouldn't have another one for 6 months or longer, right? So she was very well controlled, and so the manifestation of this genetic disorder was not like Reggie. And so in my mind, yes, I might lose my husband and my daughter from these things, but way down the road. And then in 2021, my daughter died in her sleep. And that was literally the biggest trauma. And I can tell you it was the straw, the spiritual straw, right? Like I had began questioning my faith as Reggie was just getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And I tried to work that out with God, and um, I still had my faith. But when my daughter died in her sleep with no warning, no, like, this might happen, right? And I, I, I started from scratch. I was like, I screamed out to God, like, I know you're real. I've had experiences, right? So I can't deny that there's an experience. But all the rest of the stuff, the doctrine, the rules, the this, the that, you know, I don't know. I don't know what's true. I don't know what's true. I know that, Jesus was a physical person who lived in, a historical figure, a factual figure. But all of this stuff around the doctrine was just like, okay, I know there's a God. I know that there's something. And so I went on a pretty significant spiritual journey from and experienced things that the church would have taught me was evil. Went to a medium, learned about tarot cards, did, meditations from multiple cultures around the world, and really began on an authentic spiritual journey. Like I know God, and it has come full circle. I also have a relationship with Jesus, but I also have a relationship with, my husband and my children who have passed. And so the spiritual journey, started in a traditional way and ended in a very intimate, personal way that some people, might say is not doctrinally true. I don't even know how to say it, but um It's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Right. And that's all that matters, Dr. B. I
Yeah.
mean, this happened for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I mean, talk about really wrestling
Mm-hmm.
with your faith. Okay, God,
Yeah.
you promised me my son would
Mm-hmm.
be healed, and then he's gone in 16. And
Mm-hmm.
then my daughter goes in her sleep 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, Dr. B, how long after that did your husband transition?
So it was so 3 years, 3 years. And his was very different. By the time Maya passed, he was in a wheelchair. And after Maya's passing, he just really went downhill of the emotional toll of grief also has a physical manifestation in the body. And he, very good man of utmost highest character, um, but a man, and they don't know how to deal with their emotions. Well, and maybe we don't either. Like women, we tend to deal with them in chaos, and men tend to avoid them. Neither is healthy, right? Um, and so, yeah, so he ended up passing 3 years later, but I knew it was coming. It got to the point in my mind, and I was so in shock of Maya's death and just trying to hold it together myself that like it was okay. And he's has a very strong relationship with Jesus. Like we even went and saw a medium, and Jesus came through for my husband in this medium. So there's no question for me of that was his purpose. And yeah, so the journey has changed, and I'm in a point in my life where I'm trying to figure out how to communicate that. I have a lot of really strong Christian friends who are concerned when I talk about not talking to my kids. They who would dare say that to a grieving mother, right? But um that I'm not quite sure that the way that we present God as a black and white, good and bad, you know, heaven and hell is true. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think grief really opens you up to question everything about
Mm-hmm.
what you once believed,
Right.
right? Because I remember I grew up in a household where you don't question
Mm-hmm.
anything that God does. God has the final say. You don't ask anything.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, Dr. B, when my mom made her transition, I wrote a letter to God.
Mm-hmm.
Said, God, do you like to see your children suffer?
Ooh.
Help me understand this.
Yeah.
Right. And because I was angry. And
Mm-hmm.
you talked about just now how men struggle with really communicating their grief, communicating their
Mm-hmm.
emotions. And I think us as women too. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
want to admit that I was angry. And I
Mm-hmm.
know one of your techniques in your mentally strong method has to do with putting your anger somewhere.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, Dr. B, what did it take for you to integrate and build that relationship with your anger without
Mm.
all the stigma that goes
Yeah.
along with being a woman and being angry?
Yeah. One of the first things that I remember learning, I'm sure I learned a lot of things, but way back in school to be a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and you're learning about psychology and psychiatry, and there's two concepts. One is from Freud. Now, there's a lot of Freud stuff we kind of throw out, but he did study human behavior for a really long time, and his theory on depression is anger turned inward. And that always resonated with me, right? Because I'm not a sad person in general. Um, but I would never display my anger outwardly either, right? And I think we see this in women. And so women have a more tendency to depression and men have more tendency to anger. But the reality is the second thing I learned is that anger is always a secondary emotion. And that's really hard for people to understand because they're like, well, there's justified anger. Yes, there's absolutely justified anger, but why are you angry? Why are, and you just keep asking yourself that. And if you go deep enough, you will find an emotion that you are not comfortable with, right? So you're not comfortable with that emotion. So anger is just more comfortable. It's protective. I think of anger like this, forest field around you. It does. And it does protect you. When you're angry and irritable, people, don't, spend a lot of time with you. Don't, you kind of push people away energetically, right? And it protects your heart, which is hurting. Um, so knowing that, coming into this, so in the mentally strong method, we have 10 categories. And the reason there's 10 categories is because often when we read self-development books or we go to church or we, reading the Bible, we're trying to take one concept and replace all of our pain with it. For example, the scriptures that are often used, for people, do not be anxious about anything, and that it's great positive psychology. Like, do that, memorize your scriptures. It's great positive psychology. It will not take away your trauma. It will not help you process your grief. And if we don't allow people to address their spiritual conflict, so the mental health community doesn't allow people to address their spiritual conflict because they're scared of proselytization. Like, you're going to try to convince me to believe the same thing you believe, right? The church doesn't do it because I think out of fear. Like, if we like, this is what we have this book, and every answer that we ever need is in this book. And when there's a spiritual conflict, you believe something and it's not manifesting in your life. Like, I believe that God is good, but it was not manifesting in my life. You can't just keep telling this person, just keep saying God is good, just believe that God is good. No, I've lost 3 children. Like, I can't just say God is good. And at least not that at that time in my life. And but so what you have to be able to do, and this is why we have the different categories, grief and trauma, you process and work through those things very differently. Grief, you process and you cherish. That is your badge of honor. You are allowed to take that pain everywhere with you. But what is unhealthy is when it's enmeshed with trauma and you're holding on to trauma, because trauma will wreak havoc in your life. So you got to separate it, the grief from the trauma, and get rid of the trauma. But what happens when there's spiritual conflict? The mental health professionals are not addressing it. The church is only addressing it with, well, this is what you have to believe, right? Like, this is the answer. But that's not resonating with me, right? There's a conflict from what you're saying and what I'm feeling, right? And when we allow people to address spiritual conflict, we give them, because what happens when you try to address it in the church, they try to fix it. So if I said to someone, yeah, but I'm really anxious. I'm really anxious. And God says, don't be anxious about anything. And they don't have the mental health background to really understand anxiety. They're just, they think every answer is in this book. And they just, keep telling you this thing over and over again. That's either going to, one, push you away from a spiritual relationship, um, or it's going to have a negative impact on your mental health, right? And anxiety is a perfect example because I think everybody has experienced the emotion of anxiety. And I'm not good at translation from scriptures and things like that. So, but I can't imagine he's saying don't be anxious about anything, because the way anxiety is a natural part of our body. You're supposed to be anxious. Um, the problem with our culture, in highly productive culture, is that we have chronic anxiety. And then when something that we should be anxious about happens, we go into severe anxiety, right? But if we had did not allow ourselves to have this chronic anxiety, when something happened then we would just have mild to moderate anxiety, which actually helps you function better. Um, so being able to integrate, I think God put me in the most perfect position, being a psychiatric nurse practitioner prior to any of these traumas happening to me. And then being able to work that out through the trauma over, obviously over a long period of time. But I'm always trying to figure out how to make this better and how to communicate that so that other people can learn to navigate this crazy world we're in.
Well, yeah, because I mean, grief is a part of the human experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yes.
I love, Dr. B, how you reinforced the term integration,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think there's one extreme or the other. You
Yeah.
avoid it or you integrate it, but then
Mm-hmm.
you're afraid, right? That fear of,
Yeah.
am I going to be stuck here forever?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you're allowed to question your faith, right?
Yeah.
You're allowed to say, look, I'm grieving.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I need to be put on a bunch of medications when I just lost somebody,
Yeah.
right? What if I just want to talk about them in order to start really working through it, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you from my experience, you're right about the anger piece.
Mm-hmm.
Mine, it was very fear based.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know what to do. Where do I go now that I'm an adult orphan? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to really work with my grief and
Mm-hmm.
really start to ask myself some of those tough questions and just allow myself to feel it all.
Mm-hmm.
And I know another one of your methods, it
Mm-hmm.
focuses on don't stifle all of your emotions.
Yeah. Well, and I love what you said about feeling, because this is what we don't do. We don't like pain in our culture, right? We suppress pain. And the pain of grief must be felt, or it's just going to stay there forever. And I have this thing called controlled grief, where I tell people to go home and evoke the emotion, allow yourself to cry, to feel the pain. Bring out old pictures, I have a room in my house that has, all of my kids' toys and blankets and, several of my husband's things. And like, when I'm like doing it proactively, saying, okay, Sunday evening, I'm starting to feel, kind of heavy. I'm going to go and get some of this stuff out. And in the beginning, I would say, for safety purposes, you want to have people with you. Like, I remember, right after Maya died, and like trying to do that kind of controlled grief, that the pain was so much that you can actually get to a point where you want to hurt yourself. Like you want to go and be with your kids. And I think it's important to talk about these things, um, because they're a real feeling that people, if they are conscious of how people think of them, they will never tell anyone, right? And the the problem there is that then we don't, like, it is not always a psychiatric emergency. It can just be a place of, I am absolutely overwhelmed. I don't know what to do with this pain. And having a supportive person sitting with you in that, and not rushing you to the hospital. Yeah, I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I send people to the hospital that have these thoughts all the time. Like, I'm not saying, like, there's a place for that. Absolutely. But if the person is able to say, no, I am not actually going to do it. I just don't know what else to feel, right? It can be a feeling and not an action. And allowing that to just sit in that pain. The pain of grief is hard. Like, we think, and this is the spiritual journey too, is that we think it's the end. But one of the first things that my daughter Maya said to me after her passing. And when she came to me and she said, time and space is not real. I'm right here, like literally right here. And your mom is right there with you. She's so proud of you, like, pulling it together, helping other people, like, and she's right there. We have this um, group of people who are cheering us on that we don't tap into that energy at all. We feel so alone, but we're not alone. We are surrounded by our loved ones that know our purpose and that they're cheering us on, yeah, along the way.
Oh, Dr. B, that's a whole conversation just about what you brought up. Those
Mm-hmm.
suicidal thoughts that are
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily like, hey, I want to go.
Right.
It's more so of, I'm so overwhelmed with the sadness, the
Mm-hmm.
guilt, the shame, the feeling as though I'm the only one. Everybody else's world is going on like
Mm-hmm.
nothing happened, where mine has just crashed.
Yeah.
And it's like Armageddon. I'm finding little puzzle pieces to put my life back together, but there's always one puzzle piece that won't ever complete the
Mm-hmm.
puzzle because of that.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And
So
I think it's important to, because oftentimes in the self-development, self-help world, we're very anti-medication. And I always tell listeners, if you are having suicidal thoughts, that is definitely a line that just take the meds the doctors are prescribing, at least try, like, because it doesn't matter. Because oftentimes people think, well, then there's something wrong with me. It doesn't matter what came first, the chicken or the egg. Stress, which you're obviously going through if you're thinking about those things, causes a decrease in neurotransmission. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have this thing that's forever, right? But taking an antidepressant for a period of time or doing, whatever the clinical presentation is important for your healing, because if you can't get your thoughts under control, you're not going to be able to heal, right? And so think of the medicine as just like a way to help you get your thoughts under control and then continue on this journey. But I can't stand it when people are like, oh, no, no, no meds, and it's like there is a time and a place for many, many people, including myself, where there were periods of time that I needed an antidepressant. Like, do what you need. Don't listen to all the gurus that say, meds are bad.
well, and I think to your point, right? There's so much chatter of
Ooh,
this is how it works. No, you're wrong. You have to do what feels right for you. Really lean into that
yep.
intuition. Like, I know that I'm struggling here and I need additional support
Yeah.
than what has worked in the past. So,
Yeah.
just really working through that shame of asking for help,
Yeah.
will really be beneficial.
And I always tell people, you know, many gurus in this field are male, and the man's brain is different. Um, and I'm not saying that they don't have some good tools, um, but just be careful, what content you're consuming. And if it's not resonating with you and it's making you feel like you're not going to measure up and you're not doing well enough, and if I could just do what this guy's saying, um, I want you to just take a step back and say, is that a man's brain? Is that even possible for me? Right. Um, and this is rampant, right? Because everybody's got an opinion, like you said. But even when you talk about like physical health, like the trend is these cold plunges, and everyone's saying how, amazingly healthy cold plunges are. And I hate cold. Um, but from the very beginning, it didn't resonate with me, because what you're doing is you're putting your body into a stress response. And I'm like, I'm in a stress response all the time. Why would I put myself in a stress response? And sure enough, now the new research is coming out that it is not healthy for women. So, at least not in those extreme things, right? So just there's so much information out there. And just try to, we're all responsible for our own journey, and try to learn to listen to our intuition.
100%, and I think back to your point, like really asking yourself those deep
Yeah.
questions and not being afraid to do so. And I
Yeah.
definitely, Dr. B, want to have you back on the show
Okay.
to talk more about the suicidal thoughts
Okay.
that arise when you're grieving, especially
Mm-hmm.
when you're really struggling because all the emotions, I like to say, are fighting for center stage.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like they're lodged in your throat so deep that you don't even know which one is trying to come up. So you're kind of like stuck. And Dr.
Yeah.
B, for our audience who's tuning in, if they
Mm-hmm.
want to connect with you, if they also want
Mm-hmm.
to get a copy of your book, I see it right
Yeah.
behind you. How can they do that?
So my website is mentallystrong.com. And at the very top of the website, there is a link to get a free copy of my book. I would love for you to read it. And then we will invite you to a webinar to, learn a little bit about what we do here at Mentally Strong. I have everywhere from a psychiatric clinic, if you lived in Colorado, to grief intensives where you can come and spend 3 days with me and really go deep and come out with a solid plan of how I'm going to confront whatever's going on in your life.
Excellent. So those of you who heard Dr. B, you can go to her website, Mentally Strong. You can do a Google search if that's easier for you.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get a copy also of her book, Pain and Purpose.
Yes.
Dr. B, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Before we conclude, you've left us with a lot of things to really think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Really enmeshing in a controlled grief environment,
Mm-hmm.
having that support system, right? Working
Yeah.
with integrating your grief and not being ashamed to say, look, I may need to be on some meds for a couple months because
Mm-hmm.
my old methods haven't worked. Dr. B, for our audience, what piece of wisdom can you leave with our audience today, especially if
Mm-hmm.
there's someone who is new on their grief journey, or
Yeah.
maybe they've experienced a series of losses in a short period of time? What words of wisdom can you leave with them today?
So the mentally strong method goes down to 3 words: think, organize, choose. We all think we know how to think, but we're often ruminating and just solidifying negative neural pathways. Number 2, the organize. Grief makes everything enmeshed. And if we don't start pulling that just think of a yarn that got all tangled up, right? If we don't start pulling those pieces apart, it will manifest in either mental health concerns or physical concerns. And so organizing that. Grief is grief, and we will all experience it. And it is part of our story. Don't use the 5 stages of grief. That's a whole nother topic. Um, but the like getting rid of the trauma, addressing the spiritual conflict, injustice. Oftentimes someone will come to me and they'll tell me all about this horrible story, and it's all about the story, and they think that that's the grief, and that's not the grief. The grief is the pain of the separation. Everything else you're supposed to do something else with, right? But we enmesh it all and hold on to all of the ugliness when, as you've experienced, this transition can be beautiful, and that your loved one is there with you.
Well, everybody, that
Mm.
was Dr. B that you heard from. And that concludes another episode of Grew with Portia, everybody. Thanks for listening. And until next time, peace and hair grease, everyone.